If God is perfectly good, then why does evil exist? Welcome back, everybody, to the Mega Roundtable episode or series of episodes that we have been conducting. This is Pat Flynn. I am here joined once again by John DeRosa and Eric Robinson. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. And in this episode, we're going to look at some objections, and primarily the perennial objection, the problem of evil. And I want to be patient with this, and I want to take our time and search this out, because this is something that we all deal with. You know, life is suffused with suffering and evil. In fact, we are in a global pandemic right now where there is quite a large deal of suffering happening in the world. So I think this is something that really deserves a careful analysis, and hopefully we can provide some decent answers to help people work through this very difficult problem. So, Eric, I'm going to kick it to you, because we're basing this episode, the framework of this episode, off of a previous conversation, a very thoughtful conversation that you had on your podcast. So why don't you help us with the setup, and then we'll allow John to take us through from there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the episode that we're referring to is episode 42 on my podcast, Polycarp's Paradigm. And it was with my friend Brian Nicholson. The episode is called Evangelical to Agnostic, Brian Nicholson's story. And so Brian and I have been friends for a number of years. And then we really grew in our friendship this past year. And it's so interesting because actually he even took, like he would still go to church after many, many years of kind of struggling with doubts. So he didn't grow up in like a religious household, but then in college he became Christian, was baptized and all of that. And he ended up becoming really into Christian apologetics, actually. And so he really searched for the truth and wanted to defend the Christian faith, but he had some lingering doubts. And some of those doubts in the episode that we recorded together, we talked about some of those, and they do have to pertain to animal suffering is one of his big ones right now. The moral argument, that he doesn't really think that it really works. He actually did a debate at the church he was attending. He would attend this reasons class every Sunday. And so he's really searching. And so I respect him for that. And, it's really hard for me. Like, it was an interesting conversation, because where I feel more confident to talk about is not necessarily arguments for God's existence or coming from a philosophical point of view, but it's more so like, hey, if you were maybe an evangelical or a Protestant and you have arguments against Catholicism, I feel much more comfortable. And so it was an interesting conversation. I did my best, but I'm so excited to get both of you who are way more strong in that area to pitch in and talk about some of the things you brought up. And one of those was also like miracles and how we have this God of the gaps problem. And so we had a great conversation, and I'm excited to hear what y'all have to say about it.
Yeah, just a few quick words that have just popped into my mind as you were explaining the previous conversation you had with Brian there, Eric. Mm-hmm. And one is about the nature of apologetics in general. I've been thinking about this a good amount lately, and I want to generalize this conversation because I don't want to misrepresent your friend's background or what he's saying. So I just want to kind of take a couple steps back. But the reason we're focusing on him is he provided what we feel are some really good questions and things that people struggle with. So we want to honor that. Apologetics in general, I think it's important to have an apologetic project, and apologetics really means giving a defense for a certain position. So in some way, we're all generally apologists for something, right? Whatever we are, whether it's a religion or a political position or an epistemology, I mean, you name it. Most of us have some type of worldview or some type of position that we think we have good reasons to believe, and we offer a defense of that. That's apologetics, generally speaking. But here's something that I found that's problematic in the world of, I guess, religious apologetics, is it doesn't replace philosophy. And what I mean by that is I think that if like you just do apologetics, you're always going to kind of be tossing and turning, and it kind of turns into this superficial arms race of arguments mm-hmm. without ever getting a deeper philosophical, metaphysical understanding of the world. And the reason I bring this up is I think that I found a certain security because I didn't start from wanting to look at apologetics. I started from a background in philosophy, and digging deeper and digging deeper and digging deeper, I eventually felt that Thomism offered the best account. And then I became Catholic. And then I just happened to have good answers for people who had objections, and people started calling me an apologist.
Yeah.
And it's like, but I never thought of it that way for myself. But I've seen this happen. And again, I'm not saying this is Brian. He might have a great background in philosophy. I don't know. But I see this for people who like maybe are Christian and they're really interested in the intellectual side.
Yeah.
But they get into this constant arms race, but they don't have the deeper philosophical understanding or chops to be able to analyze it themselves. So they either stall out or they don't know how to answer. And it's like this great emotional turbulence. And I think there's a scripture passage that actually speaks to this. It's from James. It's one of my favorites. I just want to read it and get your guys' comments. And I mean, I think it's so beautiful. It's so right. So it says this: if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all men generously and without reproaching, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by a wind. And how often we see that, right? Of people who have, faith, but like they're always like on the brink, right? On the brink of like, if I don't know how to answer this objection, what am I going to do, right? And so what I'm saying is like, try not to get caught up in this superficial apologetics arms race. If you're interested in the big question, which I think you should be willing to roll up your sleeves and engage in a serious, deeper philosophical study.
Mm-hmm.
I guess is how I would just approach how I've been thinking about some of this. John, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of interesting things you bring up. And, again, just to talk about the spirit of today's podcast, we're looking at taking objections seriously. And like we talked about last time, but it's a good verse you bring up, Pat, from James, because what I would say when you say it doesn't replace philosophy, just two things I jotted down is it can be viewed differently. Like nowadays with everything so on the internet and accessible and YouTube and social media and everything, there's just so much out there as far as apologetics that we almost see like those back and forth ping pong conversations as what it is in itself. But you could look at it in different ways. Like you could look at apologetics as like a conversational approach to defending the faith, but you could also look at it, and Phaser has a great blog post on this where he actually criticizes a lot of apologetics. It's called Pre-Christian Apologetics, his blog post. And he says, he refers to it more as like an academic discipline where you got to dig in and do a lot of the philosophy first, before, so there's different ways to construe it.
So of course, Phaser just says what I was trying to say a lot more succinctly.
Yeah. But I think it's important too to consider that you can go, you can go back and forth and get into these ping pong arguments and arms races, as you call them. And you could probably do that for your whole life, or you could dig down deeper into the trenches, and you're going to at some point need to bring in some other considerations, like perhaps Dr. Rhoda's version of Pascal's wager, and almost like be willing to lean into a position. Father Gregory Pine talked about that when I had him on my podcast, because you bring up the idea of like asking in faith, and that's going to sound like really weird. We could talk about a faith objection if we want to get to that, because a lot of people don't even like this idea of faith anymore. But the idea of it being not so much as, believing something that you have no evidence for. Obviously, we would reject that conception of it. But choosing to act and live out things in a way, or like an entrustment to a position that, yes, you have some good evidence for, but you make a decision that we believe is spurred on by God's grace, and you make that decision and you kind of lean into that and you go for it. And that's going to involve daily prayer. It's going to involve various commitments. And then through that, you might find an even deeper certainty, or an even deeper, psychological comfort in, that Catholic Christian worldview that we hope to find. I think that's more of what James is saying there, to ask in faith, like not as someone who's in the middle of assessing different arguments, which is important, and everyone has to do that in life, but as someone who's willing to like lean into it and say, you know what, God, I'm trusting you on this, and this is what I'm going to ask about. But I think when we're talking about in this conversation, the three objections, and maybe Eric, I'll just let you comment on that briefly, but the three objections here, I think, are important to address, because especially early in life, as young adults or a lot of kids in college, they're asking the questions from a standpoint of, well, I don't know where I should pledge my allegiance. I don't know which worldview to choose. And I'm afraid that like a lot of this religious stuff is just like Santa Claus. But briefly, Eric, why don't you say a quick word on that, and then we'll jump into the objections.
Yeah, so I think I love that verse, Pat, that you bring up, and it's so important. Like I think of Saint Anselm, who basically entrusted himself to the church and her authority, and even though he had difficulties and like sometimes he would stump across a problem that he just couldn't figure out, but he kept coming back to that trust. And I think about that in terms of our relationship with God as well, and how like, I hope that the people that are struggling with these questions, that they, if they were at one time Christian, that they try to maintain some sort of prayer life with God, even as they are doubting, so that it's a conversation with God, that it's a wrestle with God, like Israel means to wrestle with God. And so I think that's so important, because I think oftentimes when we lose faith, it's because somewhere along the line we lost our prayer life. And so, and one last comment too about this is that human beings are more than just intellects. We have emotions, we have passions, we have wills, so it's like there's a multi-layered reason why people become atheist or agnostic, and there's multi-layered reasons why people become faithful and Christians and all of that. And so I think what's very interesting about these arguments is that they really go to the heart of a human person. Like when we talk about evil and suffering, like suffering, as we see with this coronavirus situation, it's unavoidable. Like death, we all experience it, whether you're atheist or Catholic or whatever. You will suffer in this life and you will die, most likely. So these are tough questions that we have to wrestle with. Like every person's forced to wrestle with it. So I love doing that. And so, I think, John, if you want to go and
let's get into this a bit.
Outline the objection, go.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll just add one more quote. There's a good quote in the Catechism from Cardinal Newman, or Saint Cardinal Newman now, that like 1,000 difficulties do not make one doubt, and so forth. Where he's conceiving of, just because you have faith doesn't mean you're going to have difficulties. And Pat, you bring up some great, Eric, you bring up great points.
And just to play on that, a difficulty could be something that is emotional. It could also be a mystery. So just because we don't have the answer to some things doesn't mean that gives us a reason to doubt what we do have answers for. And that, I think, is a critical principle to keep in mind as we move, especially if somebody has just listened to our 2 previous episodes and you think that we've given at least a plausible account of reality from a theistic and Catholic Christian worldview, then that should bear in heavily on this conversation and how we look at evil. It's significant, and there's a reason we've done things in the order in which we have.
No, I agree. And I just wanted to add, because Eric, I think what you said is so important, that people might assume that, just like if you have a good faith life, then that means you have no difficulties, or, it's just like complete certainty all the time. And, it's just access to heaven that's, unsurpassable and so forth. But if you actually read scripture, that's not what it's like for the Israelites. That's not what it's like for anybody. Go read, we'll put this maybe in the show notes, Lamentations chapter 3. I've been like meditating on this the past couple of weeks. This guy who wrote this lamentation, is Israelite believer. He is just like lambasting God and complaining about how he's crushing him and giving him all of this horrible sickness and so forth. And like, there's literally like 18 verses of him just like giving metaphors of how he's getting crushed. And then like right after that, he's like, but I still have hope, and I trust the Lord. And like, so this like idea that like of believing in God doesn't mean you're not going to have difficulties is deeply entrenched in scripture. We'll talk about that, but let's get into the arguments though, because I think sometimes we can get accused of like talking so much about the arguments in apologetics and not actually diving into them. So I want to dive into them. And there's 3 really that you came up, or that Brian raised in your good conversation. And you could tell he studied the positions for and against Christianity, and you could tell that in the conversation because he had a lot of knowledgeable things to say. But the first one, or I'll list them, and then we're actually going to take them in reverse order. But problem of animal suffering was actually like the one you spoke the most about. So we'll talk about evil generally, but we're definitely going to hit animal suffering because he had some objections, like what good comes from it? Why is it necessary? How is God justified in allowing this and all that? The second thing you kind of brought up was the moral argument in the conversation, and Brian raised some doubts. I don't think we should accept this moral argument. I understand it, and he sees a little bit of its force, but he doesn't really think it can demonstrate anything. And then the third one was miracles and the supernatural have been explained over time by naturalistic explanations. And it's kind of a God of the gaps objection where we've been plugging in those gaps. He talks about the watchmaker argument from William Paley being debunked by evolution, and the naturalistic explanations have been winning out over time. So he wants to trust what has a good track record, and it seems like the supernatural doesn't really have a good track record when it comes to explaining things. So we're going to deal with those three problems kind of in reverse order, and we'll kind of just bounce back and forth. And then I think we'll devote more of our time to the problem of animal suffering and evil and suffering in general. And you guys, I'll just plug, you did a ton of this on your recent podcast episodes about the pastoral problem and how do Catholics think about suffering and offering it up and all that. And I thought that was really powerful when you share some of your own sufferings in those stories. So I'll refer folks to that. We're probably going to spend more time on the intellectual side of it today and like answering those philosophical problems. But if you think that's cold and calculating, check out what Pat and Eric have to say in those other episodes. So let's do them in reverse order. What do we say to this? Miracles and the supernatural have been explained over time. And he gave the example, people thought hands and eyes probably would have thought they were designed. If you're living in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, until Darwin comes along, he's got this great theory that shows that things are not always as they appear. Maybe people in Jesus' time, they could have been persuaded by like parlor tricks and, other supernatural things. And just over time, it seems like naturalism has a stronger explanatory power. And so we shouldn't really trust in these miracles.
All right.
Pat, what do you say to that? Why don't you kick us off there?
Yeah, I reject every one of those assumptions, John. I think that hands and eyes are designed, quite frankly, but I wouldn't base it looking at modern evolutionary theory. And it's funny that this one got brought up because we just actually spent a significant amount of time talking about intelligent design. So I don't want to rehash a lot of that, but I will emphasize a few of the points we made. Is that whatever we want to say about whether design is present or not in evolutionary biology, there's two stronger design arguments that can be made in which biology depends and is contingent upon. One is the fine-tuning of the universe, right? The mass of the electron, the strong force, the weak force, entropy, all of those things, right? And that's like right at the very beginning. And I don't think punting to a multiverse is going to work. It's just going to reiterate the problem at what I think is a fantastically unnecessary level. But there's an even more fundamental teleological argument of the natural ordering of things to an end or an effect or a range of effects. And that's more metaphysical. And I think that's more certain. And that's actually going to tie in strongly to the moral argument. I don't want to skip ahead, but the way I approach the moral argument is not the typical, and if I can speak just, I guess, candidly, it seems like a lot of the apologetics and the objections to the apologetics that we've assembled here, they're kind of Protestant-y, if that makes sense. They're kind of popular and Protestant-y. And I wouldn't use any of those arguments because I don't think they're particularly strong. Can they be made? Yeah, but I think a lot of them get to kind of a stalemate position. I just think there's a lot better arguments. Many of them, again, require rolling up your sleeves and doing the deeper metaphysical work. But once you have, even if you have the idea of evil, which is something not living up to an expectation, you're committed in some way to a teleological conception of the universe. You cannot make sense of good or evil apart from a teleological conception of the universe. So
what do you mean by that real quick?
Goal directedness, right?
Okay,
That there's certain ends or effects or ranges of effects that things are inherently pointed towards or directed at. So when we say that something is bad, right, we're really saying that it doesn't live up to a certain expectation, right? It hasn't really become most of the kind of thing it's supposed to be. Well, why should we believe, if naturalism is true, that anything is supposed to be anything, for example? That makes no sense. We can't make sense of moral language apart from some type of teleology. Now, I don't want to skip ahead too much on there, but I think it all does connect in a way. John, you want to chime in?
Yeah, because we're going to get back to all that with the moral argument in a second. I just want to say a little bit more about the miracles and the supernatural thing, because I think it can be a misunderstanding that like becoming a believer means that you have to accept all supernatural and miracle claims. And that is definitely not the case. And in particular, in Catholicism, we do have, some strong miracles that we look to. But most of the miracles are either related to biblical revelation or they're private revelation that Catholics are free to reject if they don't actually think that, that there's good evidence for them. Now, as far as, there's like the three big Marian miracles and apparitions and so forth that people do think that there's good evidence for. That's the one at Fatima. There's the miracle of Fatima. There's Lourdes. You can read about that. And there's Guadalupe. And those are like the three big ones that people have, assessed over the centuries, and the consensus kind of around those is, there's some strong evidence here. But even those big ones, Catholics are not bound to accept those in faith. And if you find that, maybe a naturalistic explanation makes more sense of them, you could theoretically hold that as a Catholic. Now, I don't hold that. And I think, Eric, you did a show on Fatima. So there's some good evidence, for those being miraculous. But I just want to make the point that we are not bound, because we're believers, to accept all miracle claims. And Pat, in your episode with Dr. McGrew, he made, an incredible point that the miraculous is really only better understood against a backdrop of regularity and order in nature. So you kind of have to, like, if there were like miracles happening, a few times, a day, in different places, and they could all, and like, we wouldn't even call them miraculous if there were like so many of them happening, if it was happening like as frequently as rain goes on the earth. But in Catholic Christian worldview, the particular miracles, they say something about God's revealing and God's speaking. And so when you become a believer, you don't have to accept, all supernatural claims, but you should be open to the fact, because we have good reasons to believe that God exists, that, God did enter into time, that he can, suspend the natural course of things in certain instances. And you just have to be open to that fact and examining it on a case-by-case basis. You don't have to accept everything. Go ahead, Pat.
I think that's a really important point. And a couple things that I would just want to add to that. One is, like, let's be careful of chronological condescension. Even though they didn't have the modern scientific, enterprise, for most of human history, I'm willing to bet that most people, most of the time, were well aware that dead people stayed dead. Like that would have come of no surprise to them. And that virgins didn't give birth, right? They weren't stupid, right? People knew these things, right? So, like, what would cause them to proclaim something so radical? People who would have been aware of whether this happened or not. They had proximity to the events and were willing to die for it, right? Well, it wasn't because they were stupid and thought that dead people suddenly came back alive again. Like, that just seems wildly implausible. So let's just be careful of the whole chronological condescension. I used to hold that myself, and then I realized that's not a substantial objection. And then miracles, that's going to depend on whether you think God exists and would use miracles. And if we've made decent arguments already for God's existence, miracles seem entirely open. And like John said, in order to even make sense of a miracle, we need a backdrop of some type of stable, orderly nature. So, and in the Bible, it's very interesting, is there's not a whole lot of miracles in the Bible. I mean, you have the creation account, which I would argue isn't a miracle, right? That's just an act of creation. We can't even have miracles until we have nature. So putting nature into existence, it's hard to see how that would even be a miracle. It's just an act of creation. It's creating the backdrop for which miracles would then be possible. So I don't even know if I would say that that's a miracle. Then we have the Exodus, so and then of course we have Christ. But miracles are pretty sparse, right? So it seems like when God works miraculously, he's doing it for some very specific reason. He's trying to point us somewhere. He's trying to tell us something. It's not like the Bible was suffused with just miracles here, miracles there, believe it all. No, they're actually pretty rare, which seems right to me, right? That it's a tool. It's a salvific tool. And in order to even appreciate miracles, they should be rare. They have to be rare. Otherwise, we would just say we'd probably say it's a part of nature. It's a regularity. So that's certainly important. And then John brought up the private revelations, which Catholics are free to accept or reject. When it comes to Fatima, and you look at the facts on the ground of some 70,000 people all attesting to this incredible event and the ground suddenly drying, I don't know if you can give a plausible naturalistic explanation to that. And again, looking at the background evidence of theism and degree of expectation, okay, if God exists and he founded the Catholic Church, like, might we expect that he could give a clue every now and then that points back to the fundamental truths in certain times and circumstances? That seems like we might expect something like that. Again, probably wouldn't expect it too frequently, but if it happened, it'd probably make a big splash, like Fatima certainly has.
Eric, did you want to add anything before we move on to the moral argument?
Honestly, I think the God of the gaps kind of goes both ways. Like, you can also claim that there's a science of the gaps where it's like, hey, we don't have an explanation for this, even though this shows that maybe there's a God, but science will explain it later. It's like, okay, well, that's not really fair then. So I think it cuts both ways. What were you going to say, Pat?
No, I'm sorry. I've totally skipped that one. And the more fundamental thing is I would say most of the arguments I would give or that we have given wouldn't even be prey to the argument from ignorance fallacy. That's what the God of the gaps is, right?
Yeah.
Because they're logically deductive arguments that start from metaphysical first principles that cannot be coherently denied, right? So if you're going to challenge that type of argument, you have to challenge either its logical form or one or more of the premises. But you can't just charge it as, and try and hand wave it away of saying it's a God of the gaps. That's just a basic category mistake of the type of reasoning that we're using. And when it comes to some of the other arguments, even like ID, or say take the Kalam argument, right? This is a good example, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. That's a metaphysical principle. Science cannot say anything to that, right? Number two, that the universe began to exist. Well, that is a premise in a philosophical argument that's supported by what we do know in science, not what we don't know, right? So it's based on our knowledge, not ignorance. That's a totally theologically neutral statement that you'll find in virtually any cosmology textbook. And then you had the philosophical arguments, and then you staple those two premises together, and the conclusion follows with necessity. So if you have an issue with that argument, you have to challenge the philosophical arguments or the scientific evidence directly, but you cannot dismiss it as some God of the gaps. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one last thing I would say is just I do challenge the premise that it's like we're able to explain these things better and better over time. It's like, well, look at the canonization process for the Catholic Church. Like, there has to be 2 post-death miracles attributed for someone to become a saint in the Catholic Church. And so I would just recommend people like explore those. Like I mentioned in that podcast with my friend Brian, like look at the miracles attributed to St. John Paul II in the canonization process. The reason why those are so powerful is because there's a devil's advocate that plays the role of like challenging that and saying, no, is there other explanations?
Yeah, I heard you say that, Eric. Unfortunately, they actually got rid of the devil's advocate.
Oh, they did?
Early 90s. But if they were, I don't know the exact year, but this is funny because you converted. Like, how are you supposed to know all this inside stuff? They definitely require a miracle, but the saints, there's a year of it. I don't know the year. Jimmy Akin would know this off the top of his head. But
okay,
all the saints before, I don't know, like say 1995 or something, they did have to have that devil's advocate. So that is in the records, and you can go research that.
Okay.
It is there. But John Paul II was afterwards, and some of them don't have it. But yeah, absolutely.
But
That's
it still had to have the 2 miracles, right?
I think they did reduce it to 1, but I forget when that was. So that I have to verify. But it used to be 2 and a devil's advocate. Now it might only be 1. But anyway, it's still a good thing.
I did research the canonization. I think it's 1 to be beatified, to be a blessed, and then another 1 to be a saint.
Yes,
so
I think that's correct.
Total. Yeah. And so anyway, but yeah, just to look at like modern miracles, like look at Padre Pio's life. Look at the lady who lived from like 1919 to 1960 all on just the Eucharist that entire time. And it's like, or look at St. Paul VI testing the blood of the Eucharist in Italy, where it was like type A blood and should have dissolved many years ago if it was regular. It's like we have like the science is actually using to show that these are verified miracles. So I just deny that premise altogether, because I see that science is actually proving these things to be true.
Well, science can at least help us to kind of flick away possible naturalistic explanations to the point where we can reasonably and responsibly infer, okay, maybe this is a supernatural act. And a good example of this would be near-death experiences, right? And this is one of my utter fascinations, because I think this does not get anywhere near the amount of attention that it should. And it converts a lot of people, because you have these instances, I'll just highlight it, right? And this is published in really good peer-reviewed medical journals, prestigious journals like The Lancet, of people who undergo clinical death, fixed and dilated pupils, flat EEG, they're dead, right? Or at least they're not coming back without some severe medical intervention, but little to no brain activity. And they experience sensorial knowledge of events that are happening in the real world that are later independently verified. And it just doesn't seem like there's any plausible naturalistic explanation to this. Even if you tried to like conjure up some hallucination hypothesis from like the last little sputterings of electrical impulses in the brain, that wouldn't produce veridical experiences. And that's the key. Things that are really happening, right? Hallucinations are private events. They can't be publicly verified or tested. And then you have the additional layers of evidence of people who are congenitally blind, seeing for the first time when they're dead. So I'm with you, Eric. I fully challenge that the world can be explained naturalistically, not just the miraculous, but at all. Part of the reason I came out of naturalism is because I just realized its explanatory power is not there, especially for things when it comes to consciousness. So if you think that the world at bottom, fundamentally, is just some collection of physical simples, it's disparate, it's unintentional, there's no teleology, there's no awareness, consciousness, intentionality, any of it, I think you have a qualitative abyss that cannot be coherently traversed. It's like trying to build a purple tower from white Lego blocks. You just cannot do it. It doesn't matter how much time you have, how much you tinker around, you're never going to affect that type of categorical, qualitative change. Now that's interesting, because if that goes through for consciousness, and we have, and same thing, just even principle of identity, we can, so if you think that the principle of identity is solid, which I don't think can be solidly denied at all, naturalism is going to be impoverished explanatorily, that there's something about us, something about our consciousness, our thoughts, that cannot be reduced to axons firing in the brain. Now that's important on the moral argument, because all of our moral experience depends on our conscious experience, right? So if the argument for consciousness goes through, then we're kind of already there, right? That everything in the moral realm just has to get in line, so to speak. It's going to be contingent on conscious. So if naturalism can't explain consciousness, then I think the game is kind of already set at that stage in the argument. Then we can just kind of layer on further evidences and arguments from morality specifically.
No, I think those are a lot of good points. And why don't we transition then into the moral argument? Because I think even Brian would say too, like, that's not a major reason why he's an agnostic. The God of the gaps was brought up towards the end of the conversation. And as we've argued, there's good miracles to look into. Plus, if God exists, then he can act a miracle. So if we first have good arguments for God, then we would expect these things and so forth. So a lot to chew on there. But yeah, let's get into the moral argument package. And let me just read off what I outlined as some of Brian's objections to the moral argument, the typical way it goes. And I've actually seen this pretty commonly now among atheists on the internet and other places. And they say that
sorry, can you first explain like what is the moral argument for our listeners?
Thank you, Eric. See, sometimes Pat and I go too fast, so you're slowing us down. So the common way that Dr. Craig typically uses it in debates is to say that if objective moral values and duties do not exist, then God does not exist. Second premise, but objective moral values and duties do exist. Okay, therefore, God exists, and he does it by like a double negation. You could look at the form of the argument, and it does turn out to be valid. But that's the key idea: is showing those two premises. If objective moral values and duties do not exist, then God does not exist. And the one that Brian was challenging, objective moral values and duties do exist. That's like the key second premise. Can we show that those do exist? And your friend pointed out, he says, I think we perceive an objectivity to moral norms, but we can't demonstrate it. We can't prove it. How do we know that it's actually different from just like a subjectively strong moral sense that's tied to evolution? Maybe over time, evolution has kind of just implanted this moral sense into us, and it's not actually objective, but we don't really have a way to tell the difference. That was kind of one of his objections. Right. The other thing, and then he pointed out some other problems with it is, well, why say like God is the answer to this? Why say what God says is the objectively right? Is it just because he's more powerful? Then it seems like might makes right, not actual goodness. Those are kind of two objections he brought up with the moral argument.
Yeah, so let's take it step by step. To the first one, I would say, well, why deny it, right? So we all have this direct, immediate experience of some things being truly right or truly wrong. And just think on the consequences of this for a moment, because even though we might not get a logical contradiction, we're going to get a lived contradiction. Nobody wants to sustain that objection and then have to say that there was nothing inherently wrong with the Holocaust, that there's nothing inherently wrong with racism, right? And we all just know, deeply and intuitively know, some things, at least some things are truly wicked or truly evil. And other things like incredible acts like Maximilian Kolbe in the Holocaust, who gave his life so others may live are truly good, right? So I think that there's always going to be at least a lived contradiction, if not a logical contradiction in that objection. But we can push it further, right? And we can look at this from the uniformity of the senses, that we generally assume that our cognitive faculties are reliable, that there really is an external world outside of my head, that I really do have powers of reasoning that help me to arrive at certain truths, even about the moral argument or objections about the moral argument. Well, there's a problem then, because I also have a moral experience. And all of my experiences, were supposedly implanted in me by evolution, right? Like they all kind of came through the evolutionary process, right? But that doesn't settle the question one way or another, because if anything, it begs the question, because if the evolutionary process is guided, no problem, right? If it's unguided, well, now we're in a huge mess. So just pointing to evolution, that doesn't do anything, right? Because this is a deeper philosophical question. What we want to see is, can we break the uniformity of the senses? Can we say that one sense, like our moral sense, and we all agree that it is a sense, it's a different type of sense, but it's a sense. Can we deny that without collapsing everything else into a radical self-defeating skepticism? I don't think we can. I don't think that there's any argument you could give against the general reliability of our moral sense, our moral intuitions, that wouldn't immediately bring into question all of our other cognitive faculties, including reason. And as soon as you bring reason into question, well, then anything that you could give reasons for to argue against the moral argument is an utter collapse. So I think we're protected kind of under this umbrella of what might be called a properly basic belief of the uniformity and general reliability of senses, that it is reasonable and perhaps even necessary to affirm the general reliability of our senses, including the moral sense. Otherwise, we risk entering into a radical, global, and self-defeating skepticism. And that's important. Sorry, John, I'll let you chime in real quick. No.
Yeah, let me just add to that, and then we'll get to the second part about the objections towards God, because I think that's a great point, Pat, and kind of what you were saying with the logical versus the lived contradiction. Here's kind of what I would ask is, like, if we're not willing to deny that, like, there's objective, the external world is out there and we perceive these objects and it's real and we live like that, and that's just how we're definitely going to be acting and going about things, then, and there's the consistency issue that Pat's bringing up, then why not also accept the objectivity of what we view in our moral sense? And maybe, maybe someone is willing, like Descartes and others, to go as far as they can and say, you know what, no, I deny that those objects are really there, that we are actually perceiving them. I actually deny that too. It really gets you to a pretty radical skepticism. And so for those who are not willing to deny the objectivity of the external world, if you're willing to, like, go with it, let's say if you're willing to grant there's things out there, I'm touching my computer screen and there's actually things and I perceive them. If you're willing to grant that, then maybe you should consider, at the very least, give a little probability argument, consider being willing to grant the objectivity of morality. And if granting that leads you towards God, then let it be and go with that. Like, go in that direction. Like, don't be willing to shut it off out of a super radical skepticism. And if it doesn't lead you there and you're like, nah, there's nothing there, okay, then maybe we can move on and talk about some other arguments like Pat was saying. Go ahead, Pat. You want to
Right. No, a couple things. Descartes' interesting, right? Because I would argue that, yeah, his sort of methodological doubt, right? So he wasn't really truly a skeptic. He was kind of exploring epistemology.
Sure.
But what Descartes did is he kind of did a philosophical punt to God. He tried to enter into a radical skepticism, but then gave an argument for God not skepticism, subjectivism, Descartes. Then would give an argument from God to God's perfect goodness, and then would argue a perfectly good God wouldn't deceive us, therefore it's reliable, right? And that's interesting, but I think it's totally unnecessary for the reasons that we gave, that even in that radical subjectivism, it's hard not to see why reasoning itself would be called into question, which would then undermine any reasons you would have for being a radical subjectivist. But say you did that, well then, okay, well, we've got arguments for God, say from change, and Aquinas' first way, and that's a metaphysical argument. And even in a radical subjectivist view, change is real, and that's all we need to get to a perfectly good God who wouldn't deceive us, right? So it's kind of interesting. It's like there's that famous philosophical paper of, like, God being the frog at the bottom of the glass. Right when you think you got rid of him, there's the frog again, right at the bottom of the glass. You can't really get out of it, however you try. So there's different ways, I guess, to go about it, but also notice that there's a performance tension here, because, and again, I want to be charitable, but in one sense, somebody might want to deny that there's no objective moral values or duties, but they still think that animal suffering is really bad. Well, which one is it? We have to make a pick here, right? And if you want to say that it's not really bad, then you can't use animal suffering against a good God, right? But if you do want to use animal suffering against a good God, then we're back to objective moral values and duties. And so you're kind of stuck in this weird ping pong, right, with yourself.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to that I brought up in my conversation with Brian that I would love to hear y'all touch on this a little bit, but about human nature. Like, we have an objective human nature, and so therefore we can see when there's a negation to that human nature, there's a problem. So like, we believe slavery is wrong because it disfigures the human nature of being free, rational beings. Or we see when people are treated inhumanely, we know what that looks like because we have an objective human nature that's universal. And so I think we can see that there's objective right and objective wrong based on our objective human nature. And so I just want to throw that out there to see
let me
say about that.
Let's definitely transition to that. I want to have 2 more points on what Pat was saying, and then
Okay.
Eric, I want to transition to that because I think that's a really good answer to Brian's objections about God and like, do we just follow God's commands? What if God just commanded this and that? I think that's a huge point that Catholics and natural law theorists will make. But just touching on what Pat was saying too, going back to the senses, if you want to dig into the philosophy of it, I was just going to give 2 recommendations for the view really that is in the Catholic tradition or Aristotelian tradition is called like direct realism or even naive realism, that we actually perceive the world as it is, which is different than like what Descartes and Kant and others thought. And if you want to pick up 2 books on that, Etienne Gilson, who's a French Thomist, his book Methodical Realism will defend that, and he's a Catholic. And then an atheist, John Searle, Seeing Things as They Are. It was published like 4 years ago, but he also defends like naive realism and just like the objectivity of the external world that we perceive the senses. So you can get 2 books on that if you're interested in diving deeper into the philosophy behind that. And the second issue I wanted to raise also with respect to questioning the objectivity or the implantation of moral sense through evolution, Tomas Bogardus brought this up on an episode of my podcast. There's a counterfactual problem here, because what if we can ask if evolution would have made us think that like rape is morally permissible, then we would all think that rape is morally permissible, but that still wouldn't make it right. Like, we would want to say it's still objectively wrong.
Exactly.
If we say that it's implanted into us by evolution, whatever evolution gives us is the standard, you run into that counterfactual problem. So those are just 2 things I wanted to mention going off of that. But yeah, let's transition to this nature thing, because Brian says, why just go with what God says is the objectively right thing? Is it just because he's more powerful? People have said, yeah, what if God said, commanded correct? Like, my objection is raised at God. Is it just that might makes right? And I think your point, Eric, about objective natures is where we kind of have to go next. So Pat, do you want to chime in there?
Yeah, sorry, I'm still coughing up here. My as we'll get deeper into the Thomistic analysis, this virus is being perfected and flourishing off of my deprivation. But I will prevail. I will overcome.
Yes.
Offered
up, bro. Offered up.
Yeah, no, honestly, I am, right? So let me know how I can pray for you guys in this. I don't want the suffering to go to waste. So when I said earlier, I didn't mean to be disrespectful or uncharitable when I said some of these objections are kind of Protestant-y, but I think this is an example, right? Because sometimes Protestants grab hold of one of the horns of the famous Euthyphro dilemma. Is something good because God wills it, or does God will something because it's good? And both of these are unattractive because one is that if God wills something because it's good, it would show that there's something higher than God, right? And that doesn't seem right? We claim that God is ultimate, that he's foundational, etc. So that doesn't seem attractive. Or the other one doesn't seem great because it seems arbitrary, right? Does God just will something to be good? And like the counterfactual, like, could he have willed rape to be good or something? And that seems odd, right? But to Protestants that don't embrace a classical theism like Catholics do, they're kind of in a tricky spot there, where they may just grab hold of one of those horns of the dilemma. Now, one could argue that could still be true, that God could just will, and in fact, there's certain religions that do affirm that God could have willed anything he wanted to be good, even rape. Now, I don't think that's true. I think that there's something about rape that is necessarily wrong because it's necessarily athwart the flourishing of objective human nature, for example.
Which is rooted in the objective nature of God.
Right. So if the God that we developed through some of the arguments that I've given previously and that John has explored enormously on his podcast is right, that God is the fullness of being. He has no lacks, no privations, no wrinkles, no defects. Then God wills something that is good because he is good. He is the source of goodness itself. All perfections are contained in some way in God, right? He is the full plenitude of being as such. He's pure actuality, right? There's no further ends for God to attain. He just is perfect being. So in that sense, God's will just reflects God's, morally perfect and supreme nature. So we can go through the middle. We can dodge the horns of the dilemma and say, no, it's in God's perfect being, right, that we can ground the objective, natures of things, right? Because not to get a little too technical, but like God in understanding himself and in all the ways that things could participate in his being in some limited finite way. He understands the infinite many ways that limited finite creatures could exist and flourish as the kinds of things that they are. That's where nature's objective natures come from, is in God's self-reflective act of understanding himself as both experienced and experiencer, and in that the notion of difference and how everything else could participate.
Let me chime in there because I had an interesting thought to go off this too, because I'm kind of now at the point where I'll present the moral argument if they find it attractive. If somebody is moved by it the way that Dr. Craig and others present it, that's great. If that pushes you towards God and you find something there, I think there's still value in that argument. But if it doesn't, and you run into these other issues that we're mentioning now, there still is kind of a back door, I think, into Thomas Aquinas' fifth way, which I'll mention in a second. But fun little autobiographical story. In 2014, I actually attended a lecture of Dr. Edward Fazer's lecture. He gave a lecture at Princeton University, and I was there. And afterwards, I didn't really know as much of this stuff at the time. Like, I had his book, and I was like, I was talking with him afterwards briefly, and I brought this up, and I said, would you advocate using this type of moral argument? If objective values and duties do not exist, then God does not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. And he said no. He said he actually wouldn't use it in his apologetics, and I think it's because in the Catholic natural law approach, we're more willing to base things on the objective natures, and morality is based on things flourishing as the kinds of things that they are. Mm-hmm. So how does a moral argument work in that context? Well, I think it can work in the following way. And he does this in the last chapter of his book on Aquinas. We can say that we can explore the proximate grounds of morality by examining the objective natures of things. Like, we can really get a lot of moral reasoning and ethical reasoning just looking at things by their natures and how they flourish and do not flourish. But the ultimate grounding is still going to have to rest in God, because we have to ask an important question. How did the things get those natures? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what sparks Thomas Aquinas' fifth way. And I'm not going to rehearse the whole fifth way, but the fifth way goes from, wait a minute, we kind of see things in the world being directed towards certain ends. They're directed towards certain ends based on their natures. And he actually says, we're talking about living things. We're even talking about non-living things like protons, neutrons, and electrons. And when we examine that, we say things aren't really directed towards certain ends based on their natures unless they were, given that direction by some intelligence that pre-exists, because they can't direct themselves if they don't exist yet, and so forth. And you could develop that in more detail. I'm kind of just summarizing it, but I think that's kind of a backdoor that even if you grant, okay, you don't like that first argument, maybe you find there's something to this natural law approach of objective natures. You have to ask the question, how did the things get those natures? And that's going to lead you back to God. Right.
So just to get on that a little bit more, you have this sort of insuperable chicken and the egg problem of teleology, unless you have an omniscient organizing mind of how these things have natures. So you're committed in morality, like I was saying before, to some type of essentialism, that there really are objective natures that are by their nature or essence pointed at a certain effect or range of effects to be perfected as the types of things that they are. And if you deny that, you just lose any sense of moral language at all whatsoever. Now, the cool thing about that is, like, we don't need to appeal directly to God to figure out what is good for someone, right? And think about this in humans, right? We're rational animals. That's the kind of thing we are. That's our essence. We're a little bit more than that, but let's just get that to started here. Well, it seems like part of what perfects us, which I think everybody recognizes, is truth, right? We're rational animals, and what perfects reason is truth. Reason is pointed toward truth. That isn't something we choose, right? That's something that is inherent to the type of thing that we are, right? Now, say that that isn't the case. Say that it isn't the case that reason is pointed at truth. Well, then you lose all basis for saying whether somebody is reasoning good or reasoning poorly, because now we've lost the objective measure. But then you've lost all basis for giving any type of good argument against teleology. So again, you're kind of trapped in this insuperable difficulty of this self-defeat if you deny teleology, not just on the moral level, but even for reason. And we all know that truth should be sought for its own sake, because we all just inherently recognize that truth is good. Now, contrast this with a weird atheistic humanism that would just look at some type of equilibrium of dopamine and serotonin, and like whatever promotes that should be pursued. Well, that seems to land us in weird positions where maybe we should lie to people. Like, somebody's dying on their deathbed, they believed in God, and the thought that they're going to heaven makes them feel good at the time. Well, on like an atheistic humanism, even if we don't believe that that's true, should we lie to them? It seems like the answer is yes, if that will promote a certain brain state. But we all realize, no, that's wrong. We should just tell the truth to people, because truth is good. But truth can only be good if it really is perfective of rational animals. And that can only be the case if there really are essences in teleology. And that can only be the case if there's an omniscient ordering mind that imparts or instantiates these essences that are inherently directed to certain ends.
I think that's a really eloquent way to state it by Pat Flynn. Just to kind of sum up, Eric, kind of what you guys talked about, we would say from a Catholic perspective, there is still some good arguments to make. Even if you don't buy one version of the moral argument, doesn't mean there's not also an argument that will lead you to God. And I do want to go on to did you want to add one thing, Eric, before we go?
Well, I just wanted to add that the understanding what human nature is and how it's objective actually helps us with the animal suffering problem, because animals have different natures, and therefore we have different answers to give for that. And so I think that is very helpful leading into this third one here.
Excellent.
Yeah. And let me say some nice things about Dr. Craig, and because I highly admire Dr. Craig, and I think he's a man of great intellect.
Yes.
And I think people dismiss his argument too easily. I actually think his argument, even though it isn't the one that I prefer or would present, I think it's a lot more robust than people typically just want to kind of dismiss it online. And I would recommend for anybody who's never read Dr. Craig's published work, which is really technical, really fascinating, and really shows to what a great scholar he is, go watch the recent debate he had on capturing Christianity, because that was really satisfying, because once you see Dr. Craig really engaging in much deeper work with a more serious critic. A lot of Dr. Craig's stuff that you see online is him engaging with people who are just woefully underprepared to debate him. So you never actually get a lot of substance, and it can seem superficial. But I want to say, look into him, because he's a serious scholar, and he deserves attention. Mm-hmm.
Very good. All right. Well, I feel terrible, guys, because I have about like another 7 or 8 minutes to talk with you about the animal suffering, but I'm going to let you guys go on again and still talk about it as you did last time for apparently like 45 minutes.
I'm sorry, John. We were just having too much fun.
No, I was sad that I missed it, but it's great stuff. So Brian was really struggling with this, and he was asking me, there's this problem of animal suffering. What goods come from it? Why is it necessary? How is God justified in allowing it, and so forth? The first thing I was just going to point out is, I think, like, why bring up animal suffering? Why is that the one? And I think it's kind of a backhand compliment to theist responses in other areas of the problem of evil and suffering, because theists have typically given some pretty good responses to issues of human evil and things of that sort, or even natural evil. Like, we could talk about viruses, and Pat's going to talk about that. But even like, we've given some pretty good responses to that, so that skeptics and so forth will say, yeah, but we found this other category of suffering and evil that your responses don't work towards. So I think that's kind of the issue that leads to animal suffering being an important target, an important thing we need to answer. And what I've done here, and just I have laid out, I'm not going to get into all the metaphysics right this second, but I wrote down just like what I see as like 4 possible answers.
Yes, please share.
So that's what I just like to give. I'm going to just lay out some possibilities. And then after that, maybe you guys can go through the deeper metaphysics and talking about animals and the hierarchy of being and all of that good stuff. But does that sound okay?
Yeah. Since you're on a time crunch, just lay it all out for us.
Okay. So if you have someone who's really suffering with animal suffering, possible answer number one I pointed out is that animals do not suffer like we do. Okay. And this can be found and defended in a book by Michael Murray that's titled Nature Red in Tooth and Claw. And he says that animals don't really have this third level of self-conscious awareness where they can understand themselves as suffering in the moment. So, you could talk about like amoeba being poked with a stick and just literally responding with instinct and moving away. Amoebas don't have consciousness. You can go a step up, to plants and so forth. And then you get up to the higher animals and primates. And it might seem like they are suffering like we are, but only human beings have this third level where we can like say, I am, and like, I am in this moment and I am experiencing this, and recognize that ourselves. Only we can experience it in this specific horrific way. And a possible model for this, because why I need to duck out is I need to go to my physical therapy because I hurt my lower back about 3 weeks ago. And my lower back story, I think, is a good model for this, because one time I was like in such pain, like I couldn't even turn over in bed, and like I couldn't get up. It would take me a really long time to get up, and I'd move my body very slowly. And one time I like just passed out and like was taking a nap, and I had set an alarm to get up because I had some work to do. But I knew my alarm was like in a spot where I would need to turn over and reach for my alarm. And it was going to be excruciatingly painful to do all that to shut the alarm off. So happens I ended up getting up, never hearing my alarm. And so I asked my wife, hey, did you shut my alarm off? And she was like, no. She's like, no, you shut it off. You woke up and you actually even said out loud that you were going to shut it off, and then you shut it off. And I was like, wait, I was not consciously aware of any of that. I did it all apparently like in some type of sleep or less than fully conscious state. And so this is one possibility of a model, but here's the problem. I couldn't have actually turned the alarm off without going through the severe pain, because I was in that day, like anytime I turned over or reached or did something a certain way, I just had crazy pain. I didn't remember the pain at all. I didn't feel the pain at all. And in that less than fully conscious state, I was still able to turn off the alarm, and I must have had some type of biological pain or something. Like I wasn't magically healed. My lower back still hurt when I got up later. But this is one possible model for how something could be less than fully consciously aware of the pain, yet the pain is still, biologically there. So for a full book length defense, that's one answer. Okay. Second answer. This is a weird one, but maybe animals suffer, but God will not allow them, the primates and animals with higher consciousness, he won't let them suffer beyond a particular threshold. And an example for this would be like Saint Stephen, when I know he's not an animal, he's a human being, so he's a rational animal. When Saint Stephen is being stoned, he looks up and he sees a vision of Jesus, and he asks the Lord to forgive the people stoning him. And it's possible in those moments, maybe Stephen was prevented by like some divine intervention from feeling the physical torment of his execution due to a special vision from God.
John, that's really interesting. Sorry, I don't want to take up too much time, but that's really interesting how it ties into some near-death accounts where like at the moment of somebody's death, they report this great sense of peace and comfort, or even like angels comforting them, and they actually don't feel the horrific pain or tragedy. Now, again, how far you want to take that, but it's a possibility.
It's a possibility. That's what I'm all about
Mm-hmm.
here. Possibilities. And some have hypothesized that God could draw near to suffering and dying animals in that special way. And it will be unbeknownst to us. We can never know that. So that's a second possibility. Third possibility, and this is going to be the most repugnant to a strict Thomist, but people have developed theodicies that include animals like growing from their suffering, appearing in the heavens and the earth. And Eric, you actually suggested this.
I saw that movie. It's called All Dogs Go to Heaven.
So this is not the traditional Catholic position, but guess what? Catholics have developed this, and it might be a possibility for someone who's interested in it. 2 books, Trent Doherty, The Problem of Animal Pain. He develops a theodicy like this. And actually a priest, my wife, Christine, went to Georgetown, and a priest she knew there, Father Christopher Steck, recently came out with a book, All God's Animals, where he also develops this kind of theodicy. Again, it's not traditionally Catholic or Thomistic, but it's a possibility.
Well, and I just want to address the quick objection that will come up here. People will be like, well, what are you going to do with all the mosquitoes? And the answer there is very easy. Like, a perfect hell for humans is a perfect paradise for mosquitoes. Problem solved.
Wow. You raised that because Brian actually did raise that on the show. He was like, well, what about tarantulas and like these bats, and like all these disgusting creatures? And I thought, Eric, you gave a good answer. Well, there's the harmony of heaven such that we're no longer going to be afraid of them or scared of them, and things will just work together in a beautiful way. So those are three possible answers. My fourth possible answer was going to be the Thomistic account. So I'm going to let you guys talk about that, and then maybe I'll send you – I have a quote from Father Brian Davis on that, talking about how evil is really just good flourishing at the expense of some other material good flourishing.
Yeah.
And there's also moral good. So, Pat, I'll let you do that stuff, and then maybe I'll send you guys this quote, and we can throw that in the show notes page. But those are four possibilities. Maybe it'll be helpful to Brian, and I think it's a good conversation.
Right. So real quick, I mean, this is a principle that I love. My friend Dr. Josh Rasmussen echoes this a lot. Look at what is unclear in light of what is clear. I don't know what the fate of tarantulas are. I have no idea. Or mosquitoes. I have no idea. But just because I have a question or a mystery doesn't mean that I should doubt what already is clear. And I think what is clear is that I have really good reasons and arguments to believe in a perfectly good God. And if that's the case, that I must believe that a perfectly good God has reasons for allowing suffering, evil to exist. And that's it, full stop. That's as far as you really need to take it. And it's interesting to think about these other, okay, well, what will God do with the tarantulas, if anything? Now, I certainly don't think that there's any obligation for God to preserve tarantulas. That's fun to think about, but don't like sit up all night looking at your ceiling. Like, let that question your faith. That seems unreasonable and out of perspective and out of focus. Use what is clear to look at what is unclear. And the more I've meditated on the problem of evil, which I have for a long time, I mean, Eric and I opened up about the suffering in our own lives. It's a huge emotional weight. The more I've realized that the problem of evil, carefully considered, in light of the prior evidences, arguments, and reasons we have for God's existence, is not a philosophical objection. It's a theological mystery. And it's down a category, right? Now, that mystery is still difficult for many people. I don't want to deny that. But sometimes religious people get charged of not being able to follow reason where it leads. I think it's the opposite. I think like we are weighed down emotionally by the problem of evil, but when we just follow cold, abstract reasoning, realize, oh, there's really not any reason to not believe in God because of this. And some people will probably look at John's arguments like, that's cold, but that's what arguments are. They're cold. They're cold things, right? We're just using reason. It's supposed to be abstract. I actually have to. This is a great place to leave it, Pat. I'm going to let you guys talk it out, talk about the Thomistic account or whatever you find interesting with evil and suffering. But this has been a lot of fun, and I hope anyone listening, agnostics and so forth, gets something out of it. But thanks for having me, guys. Of course, John. We'll do it again soon here. And so the Thomistic account really, really quickly, and this was very interesting to me at first, and part of what attracted me about the general Thomistic metaphysics is that evil's like the hole in the sock. It doesn't have positive ontological status. It's something missing. And I hinted at this before, right? It's something failing to live up to an expectation. It's the privation of a do good based on the kind of thing or the type of thing that something is, right? So we say it's a bad sock because there are holes in it. That doesn't deny that hole in the sock doesn't have effects in reality. Like, yeah, it's not going to be as good of a sock because there's a hole in it. Another classic example would be blindness. Like, blindness isn't a thing, right? It's something that's missing that otherwise should be there given the nature of eyesight. That's why when somebody is blind, we say you have bad eyesight. And we're not being mean. That's just a fact about the nature of eyesight. And when you have this, and of course we could do full episodes on how these implications work out, because there's some things where it's not always clear, but I'm convinced that this does work out really well. And there's a very recent technical detailed book about this from philosopher David Oderberg called The Metaphysics of Good and Evil. If you really want to go into the weeds, I would highly recommend that. Great work. But once you have this, you're kind of, it resolves a lot of issues. In the sense that, okay, God then does not create evil. He creates certain goods, and there may be concomitant, evils or privations that are necessary when he creates those certain goods, but he's not directly responsible for evil. So even in animal suffering, the privation account holds, right? So when some animal gets eaten by a lion, what do lions eat? Antelope or something like that, right? It's bad for that antelope to lose one of its limbs or even its life. Like, that is objectively bad because something's missing there that would otherwise cause that animal to flourish, like one of its limbs. But it's good for the lion to eat that animal, right? Lions are by nature that type of animal that is perfected. So there's this, and this is what John was hinting at before, there's often this sort of clashing of goods and flourishing in the material world. And that's just the type of thing that you would expect in the material world. And at some point, if you say, well, couldn't he created a material world without this or without that? I think at some point you're just going to get to the charge that God just shouldn't have created a material world. And I would not accept that. The material world is good. So the privation account doubly preserves God's goodness. Not only can we affirm from reason that God must have morally sufficient reasons for allowing any of the privations or evils that do occur, even natural evils, even animal suffering, even if we don't know what they are. Based on what we do know, we look at what is unclear. But if the privation account is true, then his goodness is doubly preserved, in that he doesn't directly cause. At most, he just creates a world where certain privations are allowed to exist, a world with certain holes in it. And then we can ask, well, why does he do that? But then that's a theological mystery. And the other thing to keep in mind, and we'll wrap this up here so we could do a fuller episode on the privation account, is that God has certain intentions, right? Salvific intentions. And in Catholicism specifically, we believe in a hierarchy of beings with man at the climax. And so whatever the role of animals are, why-ever animals suffer, it has to connect to us in some way. We can't just look at anything in isolation, for example, right? The point of God's creation from the Catholic point of view, which we're committed to, is salvific for humans to share in his divine life. And so we have to keep that in mind. And I think that helps to provide a certain illumination, because it's not just like a crude egalitarianism. Humans are special. We have a special nature. We have a special purpose. We have a special role that the other animals, so far as we can tell, do not. Now, this does not mean that we're to be cruel to animals or to abuse animals, because that's bad for us. It's bad for our nature to be cruel. So animals have protections. They have rights based on what is good for us. Yeah. It's good for us to be compassionate and things like that. But animals in and of themselves are also not moral agents like humans are. And John was pointing at, and you mentioned this before, Eric, that animals have a different kind of nature. They don't seem to be rational like we are. And if that's the case, if animals are unable to comprehend these sort of higher orders of self-awareness, to unable to get out of their perceptual stream, and this seems true even for the higher order primates, right? And there's been good studies on this that shows like they can't even tell syntactically the difference between man bites dog and dog bites man. And that's significant, right? Because it seems like what humans have in our abilities to reason, to step out of our perceptual stream, which allows us to suffer, right? We need that to suffer. We need to have understandings and beliefs and concepts, and we need to be able to understand that the way things are and that we are suffering, but also to really have suffering, that things could be different, that things could be otherwise. And that seems especially unique to humans as well. So those are just a smattering of possibilities, and that's all you need to diffuse the tension, is just possibilities. Because the charge is God, if the charge is God could not possibly have any reason or any way of reconciling this, and then you do have possibilities, well then that's all, and we don't have to show that any of them are true. We just have given enough to show no, there's possible ways here that we can. And that might not be entirely satisfying to people, because sometimes people want full, like, we want to know, like, why this particular, like, we all want to know that. But I guess the final point I'll make here is that, just echoing back to what John said, is that difficulties, questions do not equal doubts. Start with what is clear, and then use that to look at what is unclear, and investigate it with confidence and genuine truth seeking, but also be, open to the idea that, we're not omniscient, and we're probably just not going to have every question answered for us, at least in this life. And that's actually to be expected if God exists and we're limited and finite. Like it's to be expected that there's just going to be certain things that God knows that we don't know.
And, a lot of scholars believe that Job was the first book written in the Bible, and that has to do with this man who undergoes immense suffering, who is a righteous man. And the whole book is like, why is this happening? So like, why do bad things happen to good people? Ultimately, God rebukes Job and says, hey, you're not God. Were you there, Job, when I created the foundations of the earth? Were you there? And apparently it was like this thing between Satan wanting to prove God wrong, and this whole heavenly argument was happening at the beginning, which Job had no idea about. And of course, like there's this thing, like God's perspective is different. His goal is salvation, like you're saying. And so ultimately we are creatures and we have to bow before the Creator and say, yeah, I don't get it. It's a mystery. But I think for me, this objection would be much harder, and suffering and evil in general, not just animal suffering, but human suffering, would be much harder to contemplate or to, argue about before the time of Christ. But now that we have the gospel, now that we have Jesus, Christ and him crucified, God's like answer is in the cross. Like, hey, the greatest evil that happened, you could say it's the summation of all vegetative evil, all animal evil, and all human evil, because in a human, we sum up in ourselves the totality of creation, vegetative, sensing, and rational. And so by Christ being crucified, he takes all of the suffering, past, present, future, into himself. And the greatest evil that possibly happened, which is us killing God in the flesh, out of that, God raised him up and gave us new life, gave us salvation, which that gives us a reasonable hope to say, whatever suffering I see, I don't get it, God, I don't understand. But I also understand that you came and dwelt among us. You suffered for us. You died for us. And out of that, you raised us up. And so whatever I see is suffering, whether it's the Holocaust or acute animal suffering that we are perceiving, I trust you, Lord, that out of this, there's going to be a greater good. Something greater is going to happen. And so I think having a Catholic perspective on this issue is the most hopeful and the most like, it just hits us in the heart where naturalism just falls short.
Right.
So I don't know if you want to chime in on.
No, I'm with you. Obviously, I think, clinging to the foot of the cross offers so much to this issue. Now, the reason I just haven't brought it up is we're just trying to work through it philosophically.
Exactly.
First. But you can't ignore the theology and that I would argue the historical facts of this. And if God can take the worst thing that humans could ever do, the worst evil that could be committed, literal deicide, right, and bring about the greatest possible good from that, which is our eternal salvation, then like what God does with any evils that befall a head of cabbage or tarantulas seems so infinitely immaterial to me after that. Like if God can bring good out of that, then God could bring good out of anything. It doesn't mean that he causes the evil, but he responds to it. And out of any evil that occurs, God can draw. And that's really Aquinas's defense, right? And the interesting thing in a lot of contemporary discussions of this, it doesn't apply to animal suffering for obvious reasons, is that you have the kind of traditional free will defense. And it's not just that, and just to give the quick highlight, is that God gives us the dignity of being free agents. He causes us our existence, but he doesn't determine us. And that in that freedom, we can choose to do evil things, right? Now, somebody will kind of push back and say, well, couldn't God have made us free and still only chose good things? And the answer there, actually, this is J.L. Mackey's objection, famous atheist philosopher. And the answer there is yes, he could have. But given God's goals for us to develop significantly as moral creatures, especially if the goal of life is love, if love is the highest principle, then freedom itself isn't enough. Like if our only options were to choose between ravioli and baked spaghetti for dinner, and we were free to choose, like that doesn't seem like a free world worth creating. But a free world where we can initiate love, where love can be of our own initiation, not just requires freedom, but it requires significant moral room, significant moral, God has to give us the ability in order to initiate love to not initiate love. So there has to be an adequate moral space as well. But Aquinas, interesting, he doesn't take that approach. He just buckles down, I think rightly, and says, look, given what we already know about God, he can draw any amount of good from the evils in this world. And we see that most obviously, like where do we, like, it's interesting because people want answers, like they want specifics, but God has given us a specific, the resurrection, like the greatest specific at all. So like when you look at it through the lens of that, it actually, again, is very illuminating. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that is the best and most, it's not only intellectually satisfying, but it is emotionally satisfying to see that God is not indifferent to our suffering, that he literally entered into it, bore the worst of it, and still brought about the greatest possible outcome from it.
And I was going to read some of the catechism, but I won't do that, because I think this is a good place to end, honestly, with talking about Jesus on the cross. But paragraphs 309 through 314 in the catechism talks about the problem of evil, the mystery of evil. And it talks about like what we're talking about. And also talks about how God created the world in a state of journeying. It's not yet perfected as it will be. And so because of that, like we understand that these things can kind of go hand in hand. Obviously, he did create the world perfect, but it's also in the state of journeying. And something I was trying to explain to Brian is that, you know, we believe that we have this original sin. And when humans, we're not just free and we're not just different from animals, but there is that hierarchy where we are now commissioned to steward the environment, to steward the animals. And so when we fail, like, okay, then there's ripple effects. When humans sin, there's ripple effects on the lower beings. We're supposed to be the ones that take care of them. But when we sin and we don't do that, then there can be these severe ripple effects that can be seen.
And just very quickly, there's a lot of theological layers that obviously would and do factor into this. For example, not just original sin, but also angelic entities and demons.
Right. Yep.
Right? If these things are real, they have an absolute causal role. We might not be sure what it is.
Yeah.
But there's something going on there that has to be factored in that we might not, again, understand in this side. But there's a lot of many theological layers that we could, but of course it's not going to be satisfying to anybody. It would never have been satisfying to me to say that it's all the work of the devil, for example. Right. And I don't think that's true. But, you know, anyway, we'll save that for another discussion.
Do you mind actually if I do read this one paragraph from the catechism?
For sure.
Because I think it's just so helpful. And it's very, it's just very good. So this is paragraph 309. If God the Father Almighty, the creator of the ordered and good world, cares for all his creatures, why does evil exist? To this question, as pressing as it is unavoidable, and as painful as it is mysterious, no quick answer will suffice. Only Christian faith as a whole constitutes the answer to this question. The goodness of creation, the drama of sin, the patient love of God who comes to meet man by his covenants, the redemptive incarnation of his Son, his gift of the Spirit, his gathering of the church, the power of the sacraments, and his call to a blessed life to which free creatures are invited to consent in advance, but from which, by a terrible mystery, they can also turn away in advance. There is not a single aspect of the Christian message that is not, in part, an answer to the question of evil. So, once again, my encouragement is, like you say, we have clear evidence for God's existence. We have clear evidence for Christ's cross and resurrection. In light of what is clear, we can look at what is unclear, these mysteries, and say, wait, we have a reasonable hope. We have a very reasonable hope. And I know I'm kind of mixing, faith and reason right now in propagating this Christian perspective of things, but I mean, just put the lens on. Like one of my friends says, okay, if you're really struggling with these different ways of viewing the world, try it on, see what it looks like. You put on the naturalistic lens, you're going to get depressed. You put on the Christian lens of resurrection hope, and you may still struggle with like being depressed, but at least you'll be able to unite that suffering with Christ's cross and actually have meaning in it. Right?
Sorry, John, when you listen to this and see that we've gone another 45 minutes. But no, a couple points to that, right? It's like Alistair McIntyre makes this point in his book After Virtue, is like part of being a philosopher and thinking through things requires creative imagination. You don't just compare arguments, and he's talking specifically of moral philosophy, but I think it's true to what you're saying as well. But you have to be able to put yourself in another perspective and think through that perspective and lens and see what problems do I encounter or would I expect is this? And can these problems be resolved by a different paradigm? And really trying to put yourself in that paradigm. You don't have to believe it. You can't fake believe it, but really trying to think creatively through that can be very illuminating. And, two more things about evil is going back to the Thomistic account again. Remember that there's a clear asymmetry between good and evil. Like, we can't even make sense of evil unless there's first something good there for evil to attack, right? So good is more fundamental. That makes sense in the theistic account, that good is more fundamental. We need good before it can be harmed or some evil to occur. So they're not symmetrical. They're asymmetrical, clearly. And the other thing is, if I put myself back into a naturalistic paradigm, again, I wouldn't expect evil at all, because I wouldn't expect conscious beings at all. The fact that even evil occurs seems to only make sense in a theistic paradigm. Because if naturalism were true, I guess if I'm being completely frank, I don't think anything would exist, right? But certainly I don't see how we could get to conscious beings like us that could even have moral experiences. So any types of evils, significant or mysterious evils, human evils, I just wouldn't expect any of that if I'm trying to think creatively through a naturalistic paradigm. So contrary to the kind of initial impression, because there is the initial impression of how could an all good God allow these things to happen, I think when you really think through this carefully, the fact that evil exists actually points strongly back to God on a deeper metaphysical analysis.
Exactly. And like you point out, like, freedom is not the ultimate. The ultimate is love, because God is love, and he created us in his image and likeness, that image and likeness of love. And so God's ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. But the clarity that we need is in Christ crucified and raised from the dead. And that's what I would like to leave it with. I think we did a pretty good job on this podcast. I think we covered a lot of ground. And I would just say, don't ignore the historical man from Nazareth who claimed to be God,
Right. And that's a good way to wrap up. So everybody, thanks for tuning in. I guess depending where you're listening, whether you're listening on my podcast or Eric's or John's, you might have heard this as a series or one gigantic block episode. I think I might just put it up as one mega, 3.5 hour episode. So if you made it to the end, I hope you enjoyed it. I mean, really, sincerely, thank you. And I hope this is helpful. The problem of evil is not just, it is a problem, I think, but it's a problem for people of faith. John made the good point earlier. Like, just because you're a person of faith doesn't mean that you don't have difficulties. I mean, in some ways, since I converted, my life is infinitely better. I would say in the most important ways, it's infinitely better. But in many ways, it's significantly more difficult because God rips you apart. He turns you inside out. And I don't think people appreciate that. Like, when you really go all in, right, there's this, and you see this in the lives of the saints and people who really strive for holiness. Like, they are beaten down.
Yeah.
Brutally. But out of that suffering comes this beautiful love and this beautiful charity and holiness. And that's a scary thing. That's a very scary thing. I struggle with that. I'm afraid of the next spiritual root canal I'm going to get from God. Yeah. And I know it's coming because I know I need those spiritual root canals. Mm-hmm. But that's a topic for another day. So.
Well, it's like if a little baby gets a vaccine, let's say, like a shot in the arm, all they see is pain, suffering. They don't see that, hey, this is actually going to help you. Like, they don't understand that. Their parents know it, and it hurts them even, that it's like, oh, I wish this child of mine wasn't suffering from this shot that they really need to cure this illness that they have or whatever it might be. But just trust me, like, it's going to be okay.
But because I love you.
I'm going to inject this in you. And so that's, purgatory. It's not going to be pleasant to be purged of evil. But man, when we get to heaven, it's going to be like, oh, that was worth it. Or maybe we're experiencing that purgation now through our sufferings on earth. Mm-hmm. I don't understand why that happens. Trust me, God says, like, I'm your father. It's going to be okay. I got you. Everything, I love this verse, everything works to the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. A friend of mine shared that with me the other day, and she was like, listen, it means all things. Like, if you love God, you are called to his purpose. He is every single thing, even the suffering, all of it works to your good. It's going to be all good.
Amen to that. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll catch you next time.